Hello everyone, wishing you all a wonderful day. Today we're uncovering a shocking new chapter as the CEO discovers that his accident happened only hours after he decided to take Tieu Lac and their daughter away from his family's control. Even more terrifying, his returning memories suggest another car may have been following him that night. Was the CEO's crash really an accident, or did someone deliberately try to stop him from escaping with Tieu Lac? Stay with us until the end to uncover the truth. And if you enjoy the story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next episode. The CEO barely slept that night. Every time he closed his eyes, the same fragments returned. His mother's face, Tieu Lac crying, his own angry voice, and that unfinished sentence buried somewhere inside his memory. If I have to choose, then another fragment. I'll protect Tieu Lac. By sunrise, he had made a decision. He couldn't continue living between pieces of a life he didn't understand. And more importantly, he couldn't keep watching his daughter wake up every morning, wondering whether her father would still be there. When the CEO entered the kitchen, Tieu Lac was preparing breakfast. Their daughter sat at the table, drinking milk from her small cup. The moment she saw him, she smiled. "Papa." That one word still did something to him every time. "Good morning." He sat beside her. The little girl immediately pushed the old blue cup toward him. "Papa's cup." He smiled. "Thank you." Across the table, Tieu Lac remained quiet. The CEO watched her for a moment. Then he spoke. "Tieu Lac, I've been thinking." She continued preparing breakfast. "That usually means trouble." He almost smiled. "I'm serious." "So am I." Their daughter giggled, but the CEO's expression remained serious. "Come back to the city with me." Tieu Lac's hands stopped. The room became silent. Even their daughter seemed to notice the change. Tieu Lac slowly turned around. "What did you say?" "You and our daughter. Come back with me." "No." The answer came immediately. The CEO frowned. "You didn't even think about it." "Because there's nothing to think about. You'd have better schools for her, better opportunities. I can make sure both of you have everything you need." Tieu Lac stared at him. "Everything we need? That's not what I meant." "Then what did you mean?" He stood. "I want my family close to me." Those words made something flash across Tieu Lac's face. Pain, then anger. "You don't even remember being our family." The CEO fell silent. Tieu Lac lowered her voice because their daughter was still sitting nearby. "You've been here for 2 days. A few memories return, and suddenly you want us to pack our things and follow you. I'm trying to fix this." "No, you're trying to control something you don't understand." That accusation surprised him. "I would never control you." Tieu Lac gave him a bitter look. "Are you sure?" He had no answer, because he didn't remember enough to be sure of anything. Their daughter looked between them. "Mama?" Tieu Lac immediately softened. "Finish your breakfast." The little girl nodded. Tieu Lac walked outside. The CEO waited a few seconds before following. "Tieu Lac." She kept walking. "Please." She finally stopped beside the strawberry field. "What exactly do you want from me?" "I told you." "No, you told me what you want us to do. I'm asking why." The CEO hesitated. "Because I want another chance." "At what?" "At being her father." Tieu Lac's expression softened slightly. "And maybe," he looked at her, "at being someone you can trust again." She looked away. "Taking us to the city won't do that." "Then tell me what will." "I can't." "Why not?" Tieu Lac turned toward him. "Because if you want to know the past, find it yourself." He stared at her. "I've already told you that." "I know. But there's something else you need to understand." Her eyes were wet now. "I will not use our daughter to make you love me again." The CEO's expression changed. "I never said you were." "You don't have to." She looked toward the house. Every time she calls you Papa, you feel guilty. Every time she tells you a story, you want to remember more. Every time she hugs you, you look at me like maybe we should become a family again. Her voice trembled. But I don't want your guilt, Tieu Lac. And I don't want you choosing me because our daughter makes you feel responsible. He stepped closer. That's not why. Then prove it to yourself. Those words stopped him. Tieu Lac wiped her eyes. If the man you were really loved me, you'll find him. She turned away. But I won't build that man for you. The CEO remained standing in the field long after she left. That afternoon, he made another decision. He wasn't going back to the city, and he wasn't asking Tieu Lac to leave again. If he wanted his old life back, he would have to live it. So when several villagers arrived to repair an old strawberry storage shed damaged by heavy rain, the CEO joined them. At first, everyone stared at him. One man laughed. "You?" The CEO looked at his clean shirt. "Is there a problem?" "You used to complain after carrying 2 boxes." The others laughed. The CEO smiled. "Then today I'll carry 3. For hours he worked beside them. He lifted wooden boards, repaired part of the roof, moved strawberry crates. His hands became dirty. His expensive shoes were covered in mud. But strangely, he felt comfortable, more comfortable than he had felt in his office. An elderly villager watched him hammer a board into place. "You haven't changed." The CEO looked over. "You knew me?" The old man laughed. "Everyone here knew you." "Was I really here that often?" "More than your family liked." The CEO stopped hammering. "What does that mean?" The old man's smile faded. "Nothing." "No." The CEO put down the hammer. "Please, tell me." The older man hesitated. "Tieu Lac doesn't want people talking about it." "I'm not asking about her." The CEO lowered his voice. "I'm asking about myself." The old man studied him for a long moment. Then he sighed. "A few days before your accident, your mother came here." The CEO froze. "Here? To the village? Why?" The man looked uncomfortable. "To take you home." A familiar pressure began building inside the CEO's head. "What happened?" "You argued." "About what?" "We couldn't hear everything." The old man paused. "But everyone heard enough." The CEO's heart began pounding. "She wanted you to leave Tieu Lac." Another fragment exploded through his mind. His mother standing beside a black car. Her voice furious. "You're throwing your entire future away." Then himself shouting back, "It's my future." The CEO grabbed the wooden table beside him. The old man noticed. "Are you okay?" "Keep talking." The villager hesitated. "You told your mother you were done letting the family decide your life." The CEO's breathing became heavier. "And then?" "You said you were taking Tieu Lac and the little girl away." The world seemed to stop. "Away where?" "I don't know." The old man shook his head. "But you said something about starting over, somewhere your family couldn't control." The CEO stared at him. "When was this?" The elderly man frowned. "You really don't remember?" "No." There was a long silence. Then came the answer. "The same day as your accident." The CEO went completely still. "What? You argued with your mother that morning?" The old man looked toward the road. "You left the village a few hours later. And then?" The man's expression became grim. "That night we heard you'd been in the accident." The hammer slipped from the CEO's hand and hit the ground. His accident hadn't happened weeks after the argument. It hadn't happened days later. It happened only hours after he told his mother he was taking Tieu Lac and their daughter away from the family's control. And suddenly, one terrifying question entered his mind. Had his accident really been an accident? The CEO stared at the hammer lying in the dirt. Around him, the other villagers continued repairing the strawberry storage shed, but their voices seemed to fade into the distance. Only one sentence remained inside his head. "The same day as your accident." He slowly looked at the elderly villager. "Are you certain?" The old man nodded. "I remember because everyone was talking about it." "What exactly did you hear?" The villager hesitated. "Your mother was angry." "How angry?" "Angry enough that people stayed away." The CEO's jaw tightened. "Tell me everything." The old man sighed. "She said you were embarrassing the family. She said you had responsibilities in the city and couldn't throw everything away for a woman from this village." Another image flashed through the CEO's mind, his mother standing in front of him. Her finger pointed toward Tieu Lac. "She doesn't belong in our world." Then his own voice. "Maybe I don't want your world anymore." The CEO stumbled backward. This memory was clearer, much clearer. "Did I say I was leaving the family?" The old man nodded slowly. "You said something like that." "And Tieu Lac?" She was crying. The CEO closed his eyes. Of course she had been. "But she wasn't asking you to choose her." The CEO opened his eyes. "What?" The old man leaned against the wooden wall. "Tieu Lac kept telling you not to fight with your mother." That surprised him. "She wanted me to go back. She wanted you to calm down." The villager smiled sadly. "That girl never wanted to be the reason you lost your family." The CEO looked toward Tieu Lac's house in the distance. Everything she had told him suddenly made more sense. She wasn't afraid because she wanted to possess him. She was afraid because she had already watched his family tear him in two. "What happened after the argument?" "You left." "Alone?" The old man thought carefully. "Yes." "Where was I going?" "I don't know." The CEO's frustration grew. There had to be something else, some detail, anything. "Did I say anything before I left?" The elderly man was silent for several seconds, then his expression changed. "Actually." "What?" "You came back to the storage shed." The CEO stepped closer. "Why?" "You asked me to keep something." His heart began pounding. "What did I give you?" The old man frowned, trying to remember. "An envelope." The CEO froze. "Do you still have it?" "I don't know." They immediately stopped working. The old man led him toward a smaller building behind the shed. Inside were old farming tools, wooden boxes, ropes, and papers covered in dust. They searched for nearly 20 minutes. Then the villager pulled an old metal box from underneath a shelf. "Maybe this." The lock had rusted. After forcing it open, they found receipts, photographs, and several envelopes. At the bottom was one with the CEO's handwriting. He recognized it immediately. On the front were two words. "For Tieu Lac." His hands trembled. "Why didn't you give this to her?" The old man looked ashamed. "After the accident, everything became chaotic. Your family came. People were told not to interfere." "Who told you?" "A man working for your mother." The CEO looked up sharply. "What did he say?" "That you were seriously injured and the family would handle everything." The old man lowered his eyes. "Later, we heard you had lost your memory. I forgot about the envelope." The CEO stared at it. "Open it," the man said, but the CEO couldn't. "Not yet." He placed it inside his jacket. When he returned to the house that evening, Tieu Lac immediately noticed something was wrong. "What happened?" "Nothing." She looked at his dirty clothes. "You look like you fought the storage shed and lost." Normally, he might have smiled. This time he didn't. Their daughter ran toward him. "Papa." He picked her up automatically. She touched the dirt on his cheek. "You're dirty." "I know. Mama says dirty people wash before dinner." Tieu Lac crossed her arms. "Your daughter is very wise." He looked at Tieu Lac. For a moment, he wanted to tell her everything. The argument, the timing of the accident, the envelope. But he remembered what she had said. "If you want to know the past, find it yourself." so he said nothing. That night, after their daughter fell asleep, the CEO sat alone outside. The envelope rested in his hands. Finally, he opened it. Inside was a short, handwritten letter. Tieu Lac. By the time you read this, everything may have changed. I know you're afraid I'm giving up too much. But I'm not choosing between you and my family anymore. I'm choosing my own life. And my life includes you and our daughter. The CEO stopped reading. His vision blurred. He continued, "Tomorrow I'll arrange everything. We'll leave this place for a while, somewhere my family can't interfere. I don't know how long it will take, but I promise I won't let anyone separate us again." The CEO lowered the letter. His chest tightened. He had written this before the accident. He hadn't planned to abandon them. He had planned to escape with them. Suddenly, another memory hit. A road at night. His hands gripping the steering wheel, his phone ringing repeatedly. His mother's name on the screen, then headlights behind him, too close. The CEO gasped. Another flash, a vehicle, a sharp turn, the sound of tires screaming, then darkness. He stood so quickly that the chair fell backward. Tieu Lac rushed outside. What happened? He stared at her. She saw fear in his face, real fear. I remembered the accident. Tieu Lac froze. What did you remember? There was another vehicle. Her face went pale. What? Behind me. He tried to control his breathing. It was following me. Tieu Lac stepped closer. Are you sure? No. He shook his head. I don't know what's memory and what's confusion anymore. Then he pulled out the letter. Tieu Lac recognized his handwriting. What is that? Something I wrote before the accident. Her hand trembled as she took it. She read the first few lines, then stopped. Tears filled her eyes. You were going to take us away? Apparently. Tieu Lac stared at him. But your mother told me... What? Her breathing became uneven. After your accident, she came here. The CEO felt cold. What did she tell you? Tieu Lac looked at the letter again. She said before the crash, you had changed your mind. His expression hardened. Changed my mind about what? About us. A tear rolled down her cheek. She said you decided your family and company mattered more. The CEO couldn't speak. Tieu Lac continued. She told me you were driving back to the city because you had chosen them. He slowly looked at the letter, then at Tieu Lac. Two completely different stories. One of them had to be a lie. His phone suddenly rang. His mother, neither of them moved. The phone continued vibrating. Tieu Lac looked at the screen. The CEO answered. Hello? His mother's voice came immediately. I heard you've been asking people in the village about your accident. The CEO's eyes narrowed. How did you know? Silence. That was enough. He looked toward Tieu Lac. Mother. His voice became cold. What really happened the night of my accident? There was another long pause. Then his mother answered. Come home. Answer me. You don't understand what you're getting involved in. The CEO's grip tightened around the phone. What am I getting involved in? Her next words made his blood run cold. Some memories are better left buried. The call ended. The CEO slowly lowered the phone. He looked at Tieu Lac, and suddenly, recovering his memory was no longer only about getting his family back. Because if the fragments in his mind were real, then his accident had happened only hours after he declared that he would take Tieu Lac and their daughter beyond his family's control. And someone was still desperately trying to stop him from discovering why. The CEO asks Tieu Lac and their daughter to return to the city with him, hoping to rebuild their family, but Tieu Lac refuses. She insists that if he wants his past back, he must discover it himself, without using their daughter as a reason to love her again. Determined to understand his former life, the CEO stays in the village and begins living as he once did. While helping villagers repair a strawberry storage shed, an elderly man reveals a shocking secret. Just hours before the CEO's accident, He had a furious argument with his mother and declared that he would take Tieu Lac and their daughter away from his family's control. An old letter confirms he planned to protect them. Then a terrifying memory returns. Another vehicle may have been following him before the crash, raising one chilling question: was his accident deliberately planned?